And in later lectures, we'll look at how influences coming into China from the outside world have affected the development of Chinese history and its interaction, the history of China's interaction with that larger world, particularly the modern Western world. We'll explore the connections between economic and social life in the worlds of art, literature, and philosophy. Cultural and political life in China have always been linked in ways that are sometimes very different from how we normally think of things in the West. We don't usually have the situation in the West where we have a poet who's also the president. But in Chinese history, the way Chinese culture has worked traditionally, the artists were often also the high officials of a particular time. So we'll be looking at some of the ways that that has worked over time. And then we'll investigate the question of whether developments in China, the development of Chinese history, parallels the history of other parts of the world, or whether it sort of runs along on its own track. We'll see that in some instances there are connections or at least parallels between what develops in China, while in other ways the Chinese experience is unique to itself. Sometimes it seems that China has taken a developmental path quite different from that of the West. But in other ways, I think we can approach the history of China as a set of alternative responses, alternative choices in response to common challenges, common problems that people anywhere in history have faced. Well, in embarking on our exploration of Chinese history, let's begin by establishing just where and what China is and was. China is located in East Asia. It's defined by several significant geographic features. To the east of China is the Pacific Ocean. China has a long coast on the Pacific, running from fairly far in the north to the tropics in the south. In the south, beyond the area settled by Chinese people, Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam, Burma, Thailand. The heartland of China is bounded on the west by mountains, high mountains, the mountains that go up to the Tibetan Plateau, Burma, and also further north by the Gobi Desert, the vast inner expanses of Asia. And then to the north of China are the grasslands of Mongolia, and a little bit sort of northeast, the forests and mountains of what today we call Manchuria. Okay? That's what surrounds China. That's what sort of defines China as what China isn't. What China is, what we refer to historically as China proper, is the core, the area where the Chinese people, in their hundreds of millions today, have always lived. This area we can think of as containing sort of four subregions. In the north is the North China Plain. And the North China Plain is a fairly vast expanse of flat level farmland, relatively easy to travel back and forth across it. Historically, pretty well watered. It used to be a few thousand years ago, even wetter than it is today. There's been a long-term process of sort of drying out that's affected the ecology of the north. But the North China Plain is the agricultural heartland of Chinese civilization. It's where Chinese civilization first begins to historically emerge, and it is still where a huge proportion of the Chinese population is concentrated. South of the North China Plain is a region of hills and valleys, mostly south of the Yangtze River. We'll talk about the rivers in a minute. And this is quite a contrast to the North China Plain, where in North China you can go for days and days on foot or on horseback across open land. In the south, settlements are divided off from one another by these mountains and valleys. Lowlands along the river valleys tend to be where agricultural settlement developed. The highlands, more rugged land, served as barriers between these areas where Chinese populations grew up. Now, to the southwest is the Sichuan Basin. And the Sichuan Basin is itself a fairly extensive agricultural plain. but it's cut off all around by high mountains. The major way to get there, its major point of accessibility, is up the Yangtze River through the famous gorges of the Yangtze River. Very beautiful, stark, but also very challenging terrain. Sichuan has been, because of these mountains, has been somewhat isolated from some of the mainstreams of development. Sometimes it's been protected from the chaos and warfare that's plagued other parts of China. In other ways, it has sometimes served as a kind of refuge. We'll see some instances of that as we go along. Finally, in the northwest, there's a large area of highlands, of plateaus and fairly deeply cut river valleys that's very dry, very different from South China or the North China Plain, high and dry in the northwest. Chinese civilization, Chinese culture has been shaped by this landscape, and most particularly by two great rivers that flow from west to east. In the north, the Yellow River, which rises on the Tibetan Plateau and then makes this long sort of loop. I tell my students often that on the map it looks sort of like a pilgrim's hat, and that's called the Ordos Loop. And after making that long loop, it then flows east across the North China Plain, reaching the sea on one side or another of the Shandong Peninsula. Over time in history, the mouth of the Yellow River has shifted north, south, back south, many, many times. It's often a major disaster when this happens because of the flooding that's entailed, but it has been a constant source also of renewal. Silt that's brought down from the highlands is deposited during these periods of epic flooding. It's called the Yellow River because it's so full of silt. It carries a lot of dirt as it flows out and slows down across the North China Plain. Controlling the Yellow River, dealing with the flooding, the challenges of hydraulic constitutional problem that Chinese civilization has faced for a very long time. The southern of the two great rivers that flows across China is called the Yangtze River, or in Chinese they call it the Tangjiang, which just means the long river. We generally refer to it in English as the Yangtze. It also originates up on the Tibetan Plateau, but it flows down through the Sichuan Basin, through this flat area surrounded by mountains in the southwest, and then out through the narrow winding its way through central China, a very wet area, lots of lakes, lots of, again, efforts to control the flooding of the river historically. It takes a long arc through East China and emerges into the Pacific, just north of where today the city of Shanghai is located. Now, I mentioned that Chinese civilization, the earliest Chinese cultures, appeared in the north, on the North China Plain, in the valley of the Yellow River, a couple of alternative centers that we'll talk about in the next lecture, down further south in the Yangtze River Valley. But over time, the area that the Chinese people have lived in, the area that Chinese civilization has controlled, has expanded. And areas that were peripheral to the original zone of Chinese civilization have become part of China's territory. This has largely been a process of expansion of agriculture. Chinese farmers moving south and southwest into the highlands of what are now Guizhou and Yunnan provinces. Tibet, further to the west, up on the very high plateau of Central Asia, has been linked to Chinese civilization since about the 7th century of the present era. And Chinese power has been extended into Central Asia, projected out along the ancient trade route that we call the Silk Road, running off to the northwest, and then eventually extending on out to Persia, down to India, and eventually even over to the Mediterranean. The Mongolian steppes, which are very different from the agricultural heartland of China, have been linked to Chinese civilization, partly by the fact that tribes out in the grasslands have raided the Chinese frontier historically, and also because from time to time China, particularly strong dynasties in Chinese history, have been able to project Chinese power out into the grasslands and incorporate Mongolia into Chinese control. Finally, in the northeast, what today we call Manchuria, an area of rugged mountains and woodlands and very lush river valleys, has become part of today's China, only really in the last 400 years or so. We'll be talking about the Manchus, from which this territory now gets its name, Manchuria, later on in our lectures. The population of China itself has evolved in complex ways. The earliest people to call themselves Chinese, or to use a term to refer to themselves that we can see as referring to what we call the Chinese people. They call themselves the people of the black hair. Lived on the North China Plain. And the earliest states, the earliest fairly complex political entities, emerged on the North China Plain as sort of as confederations of numerous tribal groups who defined themselves in contrast to people who were not Chinese, people who were not civilized, and who they saw as barbarians. And they used a number of terms which we translate into English as barbarians, to refer to these other people. One of the key elements in this self-definition, and the way that they thought, and what it was that they thought made them civilized as opposed to the barbarians, was writing, the possession of a system of writing. The system of Chinese writing, of course, is very different. It's ideographic. It's based on the use of characters rather than an alphabet. And it seems to have emerged fairly quickly. We don't have a lot of transitional evidence about the emergence of writing. When it's there, it shows up as a fairly fully developed system. So we don't know a lot about its early stages of development. But at some point, about 3,500 years ago, there it is. And that's the time at which we can begin to see the Chinese people as a self-defined community. And this possession of a writing system to record their own history, to record their activities, is one of the key elements in that process. As Chinese civilization was expanding, neighboring peoples, particularly in the south, were either displaced or assimilated. That is to say, Chinese farmers who were moving largely south drove the indigenous populations either out or up, or intermarried with them and brought them into the community of Chinese civilization. When we talk about moving them out or up, some peoples in the south, when Chinese farmers began to come in and take over good land in the valleys, just packed up and left, just moved away. The people who today we call the Vietnamese people are an example of this. They formerly lived on the southeast coast of China. And as Chinese populations migrated south or moved south, these people traveled further down to where they live now in Southeast Asia. The Thai people that live in Thailand and Laos today had lived further inland in southern China. And again, as Chinese settlers filled up the river valleys, the people who today we call the Thai migrated off to the south and the west and settled eventually in their present territories. Other populations moved up out of the river valleys into marginal highland territories. And they have remained in place so that today, all across South China, there are non-Chinese ethnic communities living at higher elevations, living up in what are generally called hill tribe communities. Many of these groups maintain their distinctive identities. They retain their own languages. They retain their own cultural practices. And today, they constitute about 5% of the population of China as a whole. The vast majority of the Chinese people, the other 95%, are what we call the Han people. They derive that name from one of the great dynasties that we'll be talking about, the Han Dynasty. But about 54 officially recognized ethnic minorities, cultures which are not Chinese, are not officially designated as Chinese, are scattered across the territory of China today. And most of these are in the south, and most of these are populations that had originally lived down in the agricultural lowlands, but which 2,000, 2,500 years or so ago were displaced to higher elevation. Well, let's return to the story of the emergence of Chinese civilization and its origins. Most of what we know about this process, we know from archaeology. We know from the excavation of the material remains of people who occupied the territory that is today China, that have been dug up largely in the last 100 years. We know, for example, that ancestors, hominid ancestors of humans, lived in various parts of China more than 500,000 years ago. Very famous remains of Peking man found in caves located southwest of the modern-day capital of China were dug up back in the 1920s and 1930s, and these were dated to about 500 to 600,000 years ago. Similar fossils have been found in the far west of China and in southwest China, so that it's clear that there were very early ancestors of humans all around East Asia at this time. More recently, about 40,000 years ago, fossils of Homo sapiens, the present-day human species, begin to be found in China. And this is roughly the same time when we begin to see Homo sapiens in other parts of the world, suggesting that the expansion of modern human populations was fairly rapid, that the emergence of Homo sapiens took place all across the Eurasian landmass shortly after the first appearance of these people coming out of Africa. There's a series of stages of cultural development wherein more and more sophisticated stone tools are deployed, and stages of civilization are defined generally in terms of the tool complexes that are used.
Welcome.
Now, about 10,000 years ago, about 10,000, 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, a very important development takes place in central and southern China. This has to do with the domestication of grains.
We're glad you're here. Dude, Jin, did I tell you what happened? Why I woke up? I was so pissed off. This motherfucker comes in with like a leaf blower and just wakes my shit up. 100%. Shout out to that motherfucker because he got my ass out of bed. Oh, dude, this motherfucker is brilliant. What he does is he just waits till I'm asleep. He pops in, plays the fucking thing, and then leaves the Discord. So I don't have proof that he was here, and I have really bad vision, and so I have to get to my glasses and then look at my screen, and I just can't do it in time. So he leaves every time. So there are ways for me to battle this. I can just mute myself or mute the computer when I'm going to bed, which I might do. The other thing is I really want to get this fucker. I'm gonna just screen record my phone all fucking night. And then when he pops in, I'll know his fucking name and I'll be able to ban him. I'm going to get him, though. Fuck. He got me good. This motherfucker got me good, son. I have a Twitter account that's was my main Twitter account that I lost use of almost a year ago because I created 2,000 other accounts that looked just like it and told everybody to follow the main one, and they banned me. And They will absolutely not let me back. Like, I am the most hated person, I think. Like, not just as Twitter admin team. If you just type Rabbi Rothschild, the viral rabbi, into Twitter, you'll see huge screenshots that people have posted. Like, who is this? Have this person stop. Elon Musk, can't you stop this? At Twitter support, can't you stop this? And I don't really have a good thing to say except I was impersonated. But here's the thing, I have been impersonated by people on the internet before. A lot. It happens. But I mean, it happened that somebody sent a famous video to one of the admin team of Kick of a candle that I sent him that's shaped like a middle finger. I did not send that. I mean, I'm on camera. I don't have the money to just be sending prank middle finger candles to people. And that's also creepy. I wouldn't look up your home address and send you anything. That's creepy to me. But that's just how I am. Anyway, so somebody did that. So I don't know, but I know in this case at least, Twitter needs to give me that fucking account back. So here's what I did. I created a robot for Twitter support. They're not giving me back. Like, they've told me now 50 times they are not going to give it back to me. But I figure, why not 51? Why not just keep trying? I'm doing all this other shit. Why not just keep that one going? Why? Why not? I mean, it's like, it's an opportunity that maybe someday I'll be able to break them down. And here's how. They're like, motherfucker, this guy was annoying when we were having to ban all his accounts or whatever, but he's even more annoying now that he just keeps sending in all these help tickets. And to get me out of their help desk, basically, I could see them saying, you know what, just give him his fucking account back. And that's like the opposite what anyone would do, but I don't really have a choice. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I just can't go on Twitter under my own name or else I get banned. It's fucking stupid. Dude, this coin, dude, okay, so you know this shirt that I wear all the time that says let's accidentally get rich? This cryptocurrency that I'm in, I've seen this cryptocurrency start from less than a penny, and it's at 22 cents right now. That's 22x. That's huge. That's fucking massive return. So you heard my friends, like, I don't know if you heard them, but like, they're not, some of them, I heard somebody made $1 million recently just on it. But other people, they don't have bags that big, but they're doing pretty well. A 22x is all you need from something to, you know, you put $1,000 in it, now it's worth 22 grand and just going up. That's cool. Anyway, it's been around for more than a year, and I really like it because of the community. The community is absolutely really supportive. I mean, what other communities? I mean, actually, you do, but just let you stream their whole life in there. Like, that's a really cool community. I think it's a smart thing from the community. Absolutely, I'm not. I think though, 100%, 100%, and you should. The more content that you create, the wealthier you're going to be in the future. It's like this. If you look right now, people are cool. Well, who are the coolest people? The people with like old film, old hard, like people who were in movies, actors. But basically, they can go back to their work, their art, and you can also go back to people with home videos or people with like Instagram accounts and stuff. People who have recorded shit. That is important. I don't care if you were good looking or bad looking. The fact that you recorded it is what is important and what will be important to people in the future. When we look at some people, look, I'm big time Redditor, even though I've been banned from like Reddit 1,000 times. Uh, I am in some of the most fascinating Reddit like Reddit subreddits, like what? I don't know, shit like metalworking or thalassophobia. That's fear of deep water, like, or what? Like just animals being cool, or just like fascinating shit about fashion. Like, I'm in all kinds of fashion ones too. Why? Because I want my pulse on everything. When anybody comes in here and I'm like, hey, what do you like? Do you like sports? I can fucking talk sports to you all day. But if you don't, I don't want to force the conversation. That what do you like? Oh, you like cello? Let's talk about cello. And whatever. Do you like hamburgers? Okay, we could talk hamburgers. You like cooking? You like decks? You like hot tubs? You like pools? Do you like the weather? Like whatever it is, we're going to talk about it, and that allows me to be a well-versed person, I think, as well, because then I don't have to pull from people. When you're with people, I've learned this in management. There's something called the token philosophy, basically. Um, you go into work or you go into your day, and let's say you have 100 tokens. What does that mean? It means like you have 100 things that you can give out. So maybe, I don't know, you don't have kids, but like maybe you have a friend who comes to you and you give them, they need your help. And so that's like 20 tokens. You had to go look up an email address for them, or send a link to them. Okay, that's 20 tokens. Then what? Then you're going to play a game, but you got to overcome some challenges in the game, and that's 35 tokens. All right. And then what happened? You stub your toe, that's 5 tokens. Okay. Then what? You've got 40 tokens left. But then there's some things that brighten your day, that add to your tokens. You get somebody who comes in and teaches you something, or you get a really good game that you play that raises your morale. Then you can get 10, 20, 40, 100 tokens. You can sometimes walk out of a day with 400, 500 tokens. It's a fabulous day. There are other days that you're coming in to bed with 1 or 2 tokens left, or perhaps no tokens left, because the day is just taking it out of you. It's essentially a management principle, but I think of it similarly in life. I think it's a positive thing. And when I am in here streaming my life, I feel as if I'm just quiet, I'll be neutral, and that's fine. I'll be able to do my stuff. But if somebody wants to talk, let's talk. Let's exchange tokens. And I always think that that's an interesting thing. If people want to learn, I'm here to give out, but also I want to hear what people have to say as well.
Recently excavated that there were independent traditions down there, forms of pottery that differed both in terms of their design and their decoration from any of the other three, the Yangshao, the Longshan.
One thing I'll tell you, Jin, is you will always get random things in here, and I like it. It's like absolutely random. Like what? We're watching the history of the Chinese people for the last 5,000 years for the third time in a row. But then I'm going to watch Kill Tony in a little bit and fucking laugh our dicks off about people trying to do stand up. And then we're listening to AM Talk Radio. We're talking about, like I just said, fashion and some all kinds of other things. Whatever. Like I want this to be a place where people feel comfortable talking about whatever they wish, generally. And that's, I think, a cool thing. All right, back to China.
Talking about the emergence of Chinese civilization from prehistory into historic times. The threshold for this takes place with what we sometimes call the Neolithic transition, which is to say a change from patterns of culture, patterns of economic life that were based on hunting and gathering, to the emergence of settled agricultural society. In China, this takes place beginning about 12,000 years ago with the domestication of grain, and then with the higher and higher development of village cultures and a series of early civilizations, particularly in North China, the Yangshao and Longshan cultures, and some other centers, the Liangzhu culture in the southeast, and the Sichuan Basin area in the southwest. By about 4,000 years ago, this process of change has brought us to a point where we really move into a different kind of historical time, a time that we can know not only from the archaeological record, although archaeology certainly still remains very important, but where we begin to also have textual traditions, writings about Chinese history by the Chinese people themselves. Critical to this transition, critical to the emergence of a new stage in Chinese history, is the emergence of bronze, the emergence of metallurgical industry, the mining of copper and tin and other metals, and the development of a technology which allows people to refine and smelt and then produce metals like bronze that are very useful, very strong, and give to both tools, the implements of war, and objects of both beauty and spiritual significance, a more enduring quality. The ceramics, the pottery that had preceded this, that had been characteristic of the early cultures, certainly remains in place, but is now supplemented by the emergence of bronze and the adoption of bronze for a variety of purposes. This brings us to the real first historical state in Chinese history, which is called the Xia. That's spelled Xia in the modern Western romanization system, the pinyin system of spelling Chinese words. The Xia. The Xia is referred to as a dynasty by the Chinese. In their traditional historiography, the Xia dynasty is where Chinese history really begins. The Xia itself is actually sort of a transitional period. We don't possess actual written texts from the Xia itself. We do have a lot of texts that talk about the Xia from the next period, but we don't have items that come directly from the Xia itself of a written nature. There is, however, clearly a sharp demarcation that takes place in the archaeological record that indicates the emergence of a very different order of political entity. And this is what we conventionally now refer to as the Xia period. And the Xia period begins roughly 2200 BCE, 2200 years before the current era, a little over 4,000 years ago. The archaeological record of the Xia consists of a number of significant features. Perhaps most imposing, most striking is the emergence of what are called palace forms of architecture. Large structures, large buildings built up on rammed earth platforms. That is to say, rammed earth technology becomes very important not only in the building of these platforms, but in building walls around settlements. And this is a technology that involves putting up wooden frames, filling them with dirt, and then using flat stones to ram, to pound down the soil to create a very compressed and firm layer. Then you put in more dirt on top, ram that down, and you build up layer after layer after layer of this very, very tough, resilient material. So building these rammed earth platforms and then walls made of rammed earth surrounding either particular complexes of buildings or entire settlements. This becomes characteristic of urban places in Chinese history, and its emergence at the beginning of what we call the Xia period marks a real shift in settlements. Most people, ordinary farmers, ordinary people, continued to live in the partially excavated structures that had been characteristic of earlier times. The palace architecture that emerges is exactly that, or at least apparently that. Buildings which were used for the ruling elite, buildings that were used for ritual or ceremonial purposes, for sort of public functions, not as the dwellings for the vast majority of people. Nonetheless, the appearance of these buildings suggests that there's a further development in the degree of social hierarchy, the degree of social differentiation. The domestication of grain, the development of an agricultural society, of settled communities, what that gives rise to, one of the things that gives rise to, is the development of a surplus. That is to say, more grain, more food is produced than is necessary to sustain the farming population. And what this allows for is the emergence of groups within society who don't engage in farming, who can devote their time and their energies to other activities. Some of these people become artisans, craftsmen, specialists in different kinds of handicraft production. Others perhaps become warriors, military specialists. Some become political leaders, initially probably ritual or spiritual leaders, but eventually, as time goes by, they become more and more purely state-oriented, more political in their nature. The large-scale buildings, the sort of ritual centers that we see in early Shah archaeological sites were probably used by these newly emerging political elites for the performance of public activities that cemented and legitimized their rule. The performance of public rituals probably was a way for them to display their power, but also for them to sort of perform actions which made people believe in their power, made people accept their power, accept their leadership in society. And it seems that the central feature of this was worship, was a spiritual practice. Early cultures, early communities in China participated in what we sometimes call totemism, a form of shamanism, where animal spirits are associated with particular tribal or clan groups of families. The Shah state, if we can call it that, Shah dynasty, seems to have been a period where the worship of the totems of one particular family is transformed into a sort of royal ancestral cult. That is to say, the spirits not only of nature, but of the ancestors of the present-day rulers came to be seen as divine powers who could affect life in the present world. Okay, the leaders of the Shah appear to have performed public sacrifices in the memory of their ancestors, and perhaps, we don't know this for sure about the Shah, but we'll see how it develops in the next period, the Shah, perhaps engaged in a ritual interaction with the ancestors in which they asked the ancestors for help or for advice in terms of how to deal with the problems of the day-to-day world. One of the centers where this seems to have taken place is a site called Arlito, which is in the west of modern-day Hunan province, and possesses one of the most elaborate of the early palace complexes, a number of buildings. These buildings are built with what we call a post and beam system of construction. That is to say, up on the rammed earth platform, a series of upright posts would be erected, and then beams laid along the top of those posts, and then a roof built up on the surface or on the top of them. This is a very useful form of architecture for North China. It uses a relatively minimal amount of timber. Timber was not in great abundance, and so you couldn't build big elaborate structures out of wood. But by using this post and beam system, you could create a framework which then could be filled in, often with what's called wattle and daub, a kind of woven organic fibers plastered with mud. And that allowed the walls to be very light, not to have to carry a lot of weight. All the structural weight was borne by the posts. And it allowed you to enclose a fairly extensive interior space. And that allowed space where people could be assembled inside to observe and perhaps participate in some of these ritual activities. Now, a lot of what we think about the Shah period is based upon a sort of projection back in time from what we know much more concretely about the Shah. There are a lot of features of the Shah and the Shang civilizations that look pretty consistent. The difference being that when we get to the Shang, we have written records. So we have a much more detailed understanding of what goes on during the Shang period. The Shang begins roughly about 1500 BCE. The traditional date, the Chinese have a very elaborate and precise traditional chronology, which says that the Shang begins in 1766 BC. But that has not been borne out by archaeological investigations, and so now we use a somewhat vaguer chronology. And if we say around 1500 BC, that's probably good enough in terms of a starting point for the Shang. What's interesting is that we get fairly quickly with the Shang a historical documentary record. And this is in the form of what we call oracle bones. Now, oracle bones are a really interesting phenomenon. Some of them are literally bones. There's two kinds of objects that are involved in what we call oracle bones. One are the shoulder blades of oxen, which are fairly good-sized bones. The other are the plastrons, the underside shells of turtles, which are also, these were big river turtles in North China at that time. They could also be fairly good size. These shoulder blades of oxen or plastrons of turtles were dried out until they became very brittle. And then they would have little indentations carved in them. And then at the appropriate moment, a sharp, very, very hot object, perhaps a bronze poker. Some scholars believe these may have been thorn branches that were burned and then, just blown out and used. But a sharp object is pushed into this carved little pit or crater on the surface of the bone, and that causes the dry bone to crack. And they cracked in a very specific way that either pointed up or pointed down. And based upon the way that the crack pointed, the bones, the ancestors were believed to have spoken, to have communicated. The oracle bones were produced as part of a royal ritual cult of the Shang, in which they asked questions of the ancestors. They would ask questions of very specific ancestors. They would ask King Cheng, who had reigned 200 years earlier, about a very specific problem. And they asked all kinds of questions. This kind of divination seems to have gone on almost on a daily basis, usually early in the morning. The king would go to a ceremonial hall, and there would be lots of officials, and then it would be the official diviners. And the diviners were the people who could read and write. They were the people who seemed to have deployed the written language. And as I said earlier in the last lecture, when we get a written language, it's fully developed. As soon as we have it in the historical record, it's a fully developed language. We don't have transitional sort of intermediate stages of development in the record. We just have now full text. And what these texts consist of are questions posed to the ancestors, the answers, which are read from the cracks, and then, because already the Chinese are emerging as good historians, they write down what actually happened. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. A particular morning, they might ask, is the harvest going to be good this year? Okay, so they would ask this question, and they would write this down. They would carve this into the bone. Will the harvest be good this year? And then they would crack the bone. The diviner would read the crack, and he would say, yes, the harvest is going to be good. And they would write that down. And then later, after the harvest came in, if the harvest was good, they'd write down, and it was good. If the harvest wasn't good, they'd write down, but it wasn't good. And so they kept a record of questions and actual outcomes, sort of like they were keeping track of how the ancestors were doing. It's a fascinating set of materials to work with. They did this over.
It's cool. It's like they were like, well, we don't fucking know, so we're gonna ask our ancestors, but we're gonna keep track and see if they're right or not, because who the fuck knows anyway?
If they got 6 good answers and 6 bad answers, well, that wasn't a very clear outcome. But if they got 8 good answers and only 2 bad answers, then it was probably going to be good. So they kept these records. They recorded all kinds of information. I mean, they asked about whether the queen would have an easy delivery of a child, whether a toothache would go away, whether it was an auspicious time to send off a military expedition. They just asked all kinds of questions to the ancestors. Now, the function of this seems to have been, again, to legitimize, to authenticate the power of the present-day kings. They were not the kings merely because they had control over certain resources or because they were the most scary guys around. They had power. They were the leaders because they could consult with the ancestors, because they had access via this process of divination to the spiritual world. And they could use that access to guide the affairs of the community, to guide the affairs of state. Okay? We know a lot about these oracle bones because they've been dug up in huge quantities in the 20th century. Back in the 1890s, peasants living in the area where these were buried in the ground had been digging them up. They knew there was something important about them, powerful about them, but they didn't understand. They couldn't read the texts. They didn't even know they were texts. And they ground them up and used them for medicine. And it was in a marketplace at a traditional medicine shop that an archaeologist saw one of these and said, oh my gosh, this is really important, and found out where they had come from, and then began the process of excavating them. And now there have been tens of thousands of them dug up, and they've become a tremendous source of information about the Shang period. Now, the royal cult, which was at the center of this process of divination, was also maintained in other ways. The divinations were very important, but there were other ways in which the ancestors could be worshipped that were perhaps equally important. And this is where, to a great extent, the bronze culture comes into play. Ritual bronzes, objects of very great beauty, were produced for a whole variety of particular ceremonial functions. Wine cups that were used to offer libations to the ancestors, which would then be poured out on the ground. Particular kinds of cooking vessels that could be used for cooking grains, other kinds that were used for cooking meat. All these kinds of offerings were prepared and presented to the ancestors. Again, these things, all these activities taking place in these large monumental halls. The sacrifices would be made, the offerings presented, and the ancestors would come, the spirits of the ancestors would come, and they would take the essence, if you will, of the offerings. And then the food that was left, the empty, sort of non-spiritual remains of the food that were left, would be consumed in great feasts. This was a way in which the royal family also displayed its wealth and power by hosting these great banquets. Well, the kings, the central players in all this, were the Shang kings. And probably the Shah had operated in the same way, but again, we know very concretely for the Shang, the monarchy was the central institution in this political system. Now, in those days, life expectancy was not very long. Most people, probably even in the wealthier, better off parts of society, most people didn't live much past about 30. As a result of this, it was often the case that the ruling king died before his children were old enough to succeed him, before his son, his eldest son even, would be old enough to succeed him. And apparently because of this, the Shang monarchy was not organized on a basis of the kingship passing from father to son. Instead, the kingship passed within a given generation from the older to younger brothers. So in the first generation, or in a given generation, the eldest son would be the king, the eldest brother would be the king. And then if he died, his younger brother, his next younger brother would become king. And when he died, perhaps even his younger brother might become king, sometimes 3 kings in a single generation. When the last died, the eldest son of the eldest brother would become the king. So it would sort of go parallel for a while and then kick back over to the eldest line. And this went on for a number of generations. There, I think something like 26 kings in the course of the Shang period. The Shang also built royal capitals. The Shah model, the city of, or the settlement at Arlito, where these early palaces emerge in the Shah archaeological record, were continued under the Shang. The Shang built fairly large capital cities, but they didn't seem to stay in them a very long time. The Shang period lasts 5 or 6 centuries, and in the course of that time, they had 9 capitals. So they seemed to move them with a fair degree of regularity, although the last of the Shang capitals at a city, a small city today called Anyang in Henan province, seems to have remained the center of the Shang state for the last 200 years of its existence. So perhaps they were settling into a more permanent capital center. The Shang was a federation of peoples. That is to say, there were the people formerly known as the Shang, who were the ruling family, and people who were linked to them by various ties of blood, people from the same clan, the same tribal grouping. But there were other peoples who were not blood relations of the Shang, not members of the same tribal order as the Shang, who were part of the Shang state, part of the Shang, supposed to be the same empire. And these people formed a sort of periphery around the central territory of the Shang. What united them, what they had in common, was their participation in the royal cult, their participation in a literate civilization. Reports would be sent in from various parts of the territory that were written down. Communications from the king to his subordinate leaders were written down. So it's a state which now operates on the basis of written communication, not only the oracle bones and the maintenance of divination records, but the day-to-day operation of the government were carried using a writing system. It was a fairly elaborate system, and perhaps the best way to get a sense of the high degree of sophistication of the Shang state is to think about the metallurgical industry. The bronze objects that were used in divination, that were used in the ritual cult, were, as I say, very elaborate, very beautiful objects. They were cast objects, that is to say, molds were made, and then molten bronze was poured in. It's a very sophisticated kind of technology. The whole metallurgical industry involved mining, smelting, refining, blending different metals together to produce the right kind of bronze, the design of the objects, the making of the molds, the pouring of the objects, finishing them. All this was organized by the Shang state. It was officially run. And that involved the organization of large numbers of people. It involved activities at a number of sites. The mines were not in the same place as the centers of Shang civilization. We know from the excavation of the last Shang capital at Anyang that there were huge workshops, forges, places where the metal was cast. All kinds of settlement areas where the craftsmen, the artisans who worked in the different phases of the metallurgical industry were housed. A very elaborate system, clearly organized, and administered very effectively by the royal state. To do that required both managerial skills, but it also required a capacity to feed people, to clothe people, to house people, which meant that all these things had to be paid for. And this is how we know that the Shang had an elaborate taxation system. We know from the divination records and from other inscriptions from the time that so-called tribute payments were made by the various subordinate peoples who were part of the Shang polity. And these, in effect, were taxes. These were ways in which the royal center drew from the peripheral settlements the wealth that it needed to sustain its military infrastructure and the metallurgical industry. And of course, the metallurgical industry was critical to its maintenance of its own legitimacy, its own public authority. All right. Now, this system functioned pretty smoothly for a long time. We know, again, from the divination records that the peoples outside of Shang civilization, the so-called barbarians, who lived north, south, east, west, all around the Shang, were a constant concern. The diviners are frequently asking the ancestors for advice. Should we launch an expedition to punish the people in the east? Should we expect that the barbarians from the north will raid at harvest time? All kinds of concerns, all kinds of anxieties are in evidence in the questions that are asked. And we know from the answers and from the outcome statements that there were frequent devastating raids, that non-Chinese peoples intruded into the settled areas, intruded into the agricultural heartland, and carried off not only food and other kinds of supplies, but people as well were taken away and enslaved in these non-Chinese areas, or these non-Shang areas. So the maintenance of security was one of the critical functions of the Shang state as well. In that function, they ran into some problems as time went by. And these problems had to do with mobilizing resources and deploying force to secure the state, to secure the territory. But that generated tensions and unrest within the Shang territory itself. What seems to have happened is that subordinate peoples, and there were many of them, became resentful as time went on of the tribute that they paid to the Shang rulers, particularly as security around the perimeter of the Shang territory seemed to be breaking down. If they were going to be paying tribute, if they were going to be offering up wealth to the Shang kings, then they expected to live in secure and stable conditions. But increasingly, as we get down to about the 11th century BC, those conditions were not being maintained. That led to unrest and frustration among the people, among many of the subordinate peoples who constituted the Shang polity. And that unrest eventually led to efforts by some of those people to overthrow the Shang and to establish their own power in succession, just as the Shang had emerged as the successors to the Shang. We'll turn our attention to the overthrow of the Shang and the emergence of the next dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, in the next lecture. We've been talking about the emergence of Chinese civilization. We've traced this down thus far from its origins back in prehistoric Neolithic times to the first dynasties in the traditional Chinese historiography, the Xia and the Shang, which emerged in North China, built up largely around bronze civilization, developed royal monarchical systems, worship of the ancestors of the rulers being a critical component of their early states. We've learned a lot about these early periods in Chinese history from archaeology, from the excavation of the oracle bones that we talked about last time, the records of divination, the records of consultations, if you will, with the Shang ancestors. And what's interesting in some ways about this is the degree to which the archaeological record and the information recorded in texts like the oracle bones has confirmed, has agreed with the traditional mythological accounts of Chinese history. And before I go on to talk a little about the next dynastic period, the rise of the Zhou dynasty, I want to just mention briefly some of the contrasts between the mythological record and the archaeological record, or the textual tradition that we've had emerge about the Xia and the Shang. The Chinese have a very elaborate account of their own origins. They don't have a creation myth in exactly the same way that many Western civilizations do. But instead, their traditions begin with what we sometimes call the sage kings or the sage emperors, figures of high antiquity, posited to be long before the emergence even of the Shah. Perhaps the most notable, a pair of early kings or early emperors, Yao and Shun. Yao being the first man to pass the throne on to a successor. Prior to that, there had been a number of critical leaders, but it's Yao who begins the process of continuous rule, of having a regular succession from one king to the next. What's interesting about Yao is that he does not pass the throne on to his son, nor, on the model of the Shang, does he pass it to a brother, but instead, Shun, the next emperor, the next sage ruler, is chosen because of his moral qualities, his moral virtues. Yao's own son is considered to be weak and decadent, and so he searches around in the kingdom, in the empire, for a worthy successor. And Shun is brought to his attention, is picked out, and is given the honor of inheriting the throne. It's interesting because it's a contrast with the actual practice of all the historical dynasties that we know of in China, where succession was a matter of keeping the throne keeping power within a particular family. But it's important. It highlights another aspect of Chinese political culture, which is the centrality of moral qualities. We'll be looking